to another episode of the Everyday Environment Podcast, where we explore the environment we see every day. I'm your host, Amy Leppernhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Erin Garrett.
And today we are here with Michelle Wander. Michelle is an emeritus soil scientist in the Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences Department at the University of Illinois. And we are here to talk to Michelle about soil health and the effects of climate change on our soil. We're really excited to talk about this. So welcome, Michelle.
Nice to be here.
Thank you for being here. So let's start off, first off, just with the basics today, Michelle. And why don't we just have you tell us just a little bit about yourself and your area of expertise?
I'm a soil ecologist and had the opportunity to study, work, and also farm. My husband, now retired organic farmer, in many places in the U.S. So from the Midwest and Ohio, where I started, going to Georgia, going to California, going here. And I've also lived and worked in agriculture in Hawaii. So I've seen a lot of different soil resources and farming systems, and really been interested in kind of the systems ecology of those systems, which is really, trying to think about how we're going to maintain them sustainably to support environmental function and human well-being.
That's cool. So you've been all over the place.
Yeah, and it's nice in a way to see lots of different soil resources that we can't paint with too broad a brush, right? Each soil has its own Achilles heels and opportunities.
How long have you been in Illinois?
30 years.
Oh,
so hence, that's why I get to retire. But keep working on things like this that I'm interested in. So
Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
Congratulations on the retirement, and we're happy that you're here chatting with us. When we talk about soil today, we're going to get into kind of the nitty-gritty, but starting broad, can you just tell us a little bit about the importance of soil health in general?
I myself have been really interested in, like many students, that are drawn to an innate appreciation of the importance of soil that many people feel. And sort of after being an academic, looking at soil health, soil quality, kind of really researching the background. And you see all through religious, spiritual, and sort of natural philosophy, people equating care for their land and their resources with care for themselves. And that makes a lot of sense for people who are living in a subsistence environment. That intuition, I think, is really there. A lot of the science and work that we've done around it hasn't been the main thing that's spoken to the public, and the public's kind of wisdom that this is a really important thing. I think we've seen in recent years, in this last decade, a real push around soil health, soil quality, to re-raise public awareness. And part of that is to support policies. Or also, one thing I think that's really important about soils is, and some people who've studied soils and soil formation, they're kind of a memory of that land use history, and also of management. So they're kind of long-term recording devices. And for us to manage the environment and be good stewards, we have to be able to somehow break out of our short-term needs. And so that's a real interesting topic for me about, this connection between the well-being of ourselves now and also into the future. And so I think people who use that term soil health have that mindfulness and that appreciation, not only of the here and now, but of the future.
Yeah, I really love that. I teach a community college course, and I teach the natural resource management course there, but I'm teaching a lot of the agriculture students. And every year I'm just amazed by, they're all, well, I wouldn't say they're all from a farming background, but a majority of them are from a farming background. And I always have them put together a soil conservation plan and think about their soil. They've taken soil science and basic soil classes. But it's really interesting when they start thinking about the future and start thinking about the conservation aspect of soils, is when they really start thinking about the future. Like you said, Michelle, they start thinking about the legacy that their family has given to them, and then what they're going to do with that, and the pride that they have in their farm, what legacy they're going to leave. So that connection to the soil, the connection to the land is inherently there, even in these younger generations that are just moving into the workforce, which again is hopeful, right? So we're going to talk about then the kind of the flip side. So we talked about soil health. What are the main causes of soil degradation, or some of that, I guess, the threats to the health of our soil that we're seeing just generally overall?
Yeah, so I know your sort of an overarching concern is climate. And often with climate, the impacts of climate change are going to vary spatially across the globe. And so different regions overlay soils that have different inherent qualities in them and have resistance and resilience. Often we use that language around natural resources and in general, and that can apply to soils. And so you would think about the soil formed in place, and some soils are much more vulnerable to onslaughts and some are much more resistant. So when I moved here from Georgia, my supervisor there said, "Oh, you're going to Illinois. Those soils are so boring." And he meant that, because in Georgia, they have all these problems because the soils are older, so they're more weathered, so they've lost a lot of their inherent fertility. And here, because of more recent glaciation and climate and the past land cover of these prairies, which were really good at building soil organic matter, especially like we have differences within the state based on how recently we were glaciated. So, where we have deposition, and you being in Quincy, that's sort of really interesting because we have big deposits of eroded materials that had a lot of nutrients that then got windblown as a blanket that's thicker. And so we have, even a lot of diversity in Illinois in terms of that inherent kind of bank account, right? Our piggy bank of the soil. So in terms of degradation, we have many different things that can really degrade soil. For example, pollution. If you put a heavy metal into a soil, you're going to destroy it forever. That's in these now PFAS or these little plastics, those are forever chemicals. We are, some people where they've gotten into waste streams and then been land applied, totally destroyed that land. But I think in terms of the climate conversation, this sort of large awareness that for regions that have rain-fed agriculture, and a lot of our very efficient agriculture, like we have in Illinois, other places, this change in the climate, and years ago, I worked with the Union of Concerned Scientists on climate change. And it was like, you think we're making this up where we're going to have all of these horrors of, we're going to have a lot more intense rain during the period of time where most of our land is bare. So we're going to accelerate erosion. So like as a ballpark number, we use these things called R factors in soils where they're integrating the erosive potential of the rainfall. So that's sort of how much rain and how hard it falls. It actually, like slow motion photography shows these divots that, welts in the soil. So the R factor is going to increase, sort of within our region between 33 and 66%. So that's a lot of erosive power. And so this conversation around climate change and what we could do to offset it, around practices, it's that timing of the worst rain when the soils are very vulnerable is going to really accelerate erosion. So for soil conservation in that conversation, it's often focused on erosion and erosion prevention. And, that's where you basically, if you have surface runoff, the smaller particles, which are the more nutrient rich and organic matter rich, those are the things that get moved off farm. So some people say, well, no biggie, those are, going to accumulate in ditches and that'll be better for carbon sequestration, which is, this other term. But in terms of productivity and impoverishment of soils, that's a real loss. And with these intensified rains, and then we see drought, right? So we have like the spigot goes on, then the spigot shuts off. So water holding capacity in any soil is really, it's influenced by the particle sizes that, whether you have a sand, silt, or clay. Often we describe soils based on the relative size. And those aren't really just relative size. The actual minerals in those classes differ. So the sand part is quartz, right? Like the beach. And there's not a lot of fertility in that. Soils that are really weathered, they have less potential. So we are kind of have a responsibility on us in Illinois because we've got some of the best soil out there, and we really luck out to have enough rainfall so that it's a really relatively efficient production versus an irrigated system. In that irrigated system, now the water holding potential, which is soil structure, is enhanced by organic matter, and also the actual attractiveness of the soil particles in organic matter because it's got a lot of charge, and water is polar, so it's really sticky to things that are charged. That's really important for us so that In terms of soil structure and soil management, which we would talk about in agriculture, which, I might slip in here to an emphasis on Illinois issues. There are others, but, so for our Illinois system, that's what we're thinking about: rain-fed agriculture, structure, water holding, resistance to erosion. Also, a lot of the soil biology, which now I think is one of the areas which, people look to, what is the potential here and benefits. But in terms of just, for me, it's kind of, we can keep it simple and say, build it and they will come. You're going to have a good rooting environment and good root health and microbial ecology in a system that you're feeding the soil. We hear that phrase, which is a good kind of rule of thumb. So if you're building and maintaining organic matter in our system, that's good. But if you're eroding the system, or if you're depleting that system by not returning enough biomass, and that's biomass of high quality throughout the season, you're going to starve that soil. So I think a lot of our people in regenerative ag pushing the conversation around, say, cover cropping or diversification that has more live plant matter throughout the year is really right on target.
So what I heard there, Michelle, was the soils in Illinois have, erodibility of would you say medium? I guess I don't know how you would probably value that, but they're kind of middle of the erodibility, or that it's all around, all over the charts with that R factor in Illinois.
So the R factor basically is very influenced spatially from west to east. And so there's sort of like starting around you, the R factor shoots up and we come really at risk, but it gets worse towards the southeast. We have this sort of gradient, but we really have issues. And even within a state and exposures, you would break it apart and have different erodibilities based on the soil texture. The slope is a huge factor, all those things that go into a lot of our models. Right. So we would have different places that are more and less vulnerable. But any soil, if you've got good vegetative cover on it, is safe, or relatively safe, within. So for Illinois, for us, erosion is our likely factor in our agricultural lands. We have lots of other places where we might have, and like in the Dakotas, so they're right on that border where we transition, but they're drier. They have salinization, which all through the West, we're losing a lot of productive land to it becoming, and this is sort of aridification. And even within some places in Illinois, we might be having that problem based on their texture. So some of our sandy soils, and where we have soils in the South, and actually in Southern Illinois, we have some places, because we were in a seabed at one point, right? So we have below ground stashes in some places where water was concentrated, evaporated, and we have a lot of salts, and those can be brought up. So, this sounds like I'm like Debbie Downer. We have many horrors that we could go on about threats to the soil, but, these are sort of broad regional things that climate change in the country, we would look and say, we got really problems with salinization and terrible loss of productive lands in the West. And in the East, erosion is our real concern.
Right. In the middle. Right.
Yeah. We're right on that edge. But really, we're lucky. Salinization so far in Illinois isn't real, but in our Dakotas, our near neighbors in Minnesota, they're really seeing some issues, which is, to me, kind of shocking.
What are some practices, you mentioned a couple, but what are some of those practices agriculturally that are being implemented to try to improve soil health and kind of combat this erosion?
The new kid on the block that I think we see a lot of pressure in terms of policy, changing in some of our penalties for farmers for when they plant, compatibility with the enrollment in the government programs, and for cover cropping, availability of seed, breeding and selection of seed, improvement of the equipment to plant that seed, improvement of technologies to terminate that biomass, all those things. We have a lot of interest in improving that to make it more workable for farmers. That's a really important opportunity, although still the adoption and uptake of that is nowhere near what we would like and what we would need. So if we could change the system to make it easier. So, and some of this, annual crop agriculture requires this disruption and replacement and creates these patches in time where the soil is really vulnerable. And so, some of this intercropping of cover crops, or in Southern Illinois, we see some double cropping of wheat and soybean, for example. Some of those systems are a little more risk averse and keep more cover. In my view, that's sort of the low bar in our annual systems to fix them is cover cropping if we're going to remain dependent on this system, which also, we have this kind of ratcheting up of use of herbicides and insecticides and now prophylactic spraying, that are really kind of tied to that system. And some of those things, it would be ideal to work around those and also anticipate what other costs they're having, say to pollinators, to aquatic species, frogs and toads. And I think a lot of that thing, and that's actually one area in my retirement, really pushing out this kind of, let's consider the biodiversity costs and trade-offs here. Because I think, and I've worked with many, many farmers who are very conservation minded, and many of them struggle personally with those trade-offs because at the end of the day, and this again goes back to the theme about short-term stresses and long-term goals. So many of them are seeking to achieve their long-term goals, but the short-term stresses prevent them from going as far along conservation road as they could. On the conservation road, cover cropping is great, and it would be wonderful if, we take the risk out of it so more farmers adopt it. And I think Illinois has taken some lead in some programs to try to do some of that, and that's awesome. Going to a more permanently perennial system is great. I think we need to really invest in that. We haven't done the R&D for our region and develop markets, for example, to make that really practical. I think we see with efforts, for example, the recent efforts on miscanthus to try to make markets and make products and make uses and all that. That's really interesting because you see kind of the lock-in of farmers who are in row crop systems and they have all their investment in that infrastructure and the markets. So some of them may want to move, but that move, I think understanding some of that system level constraints and how to help people move without huge risk, because this is their entire wealth is invested in a system. So it's interesting, people at scholarship around the policy, the markets, those drivers. And often as a soil scientist, I've been asked and done trying to make the case on the carbon sequestration, for example. But if you don't have the economics and take the risk out of it, that's not going to sell it to farmers, right?
Right. Elaborate a little bit more on carbon sequestration. So I've heard this term. I have not dove deep into this term too far, but just talk about that a little more.
And this is really where, in terms of people who are going to try to verify a change in the concentration, the stock of soil, and attribute that gain to the adoption of a practice, get all angsty and, the definitions about, all of that stuff in terms of, gaining new carbon that wasn't there previously and maintaining it, and having permanence to that gain, for some reasonable amounts of time. So that sequestration is this idea that you're going to basically store it in the soil. And that ask and emphasis for people to offset climate change, and in part, is this logical thing for people to realize, hey, we've lost since we adopted the plow and we broke the prairie or, did disturbance agriculture. We've lost half that stock because we have a large area. That's a huge amount of carbon. And the relative cost of sequestering it and moving that backwards and the available existing knowledge of technology is there. It's been there for decades. And you asked about conservation practices. You go back, for the playbook to the 30s, and most of these things have been known. We might have perfected and made some advances, but in terms of knowing, it's like managing your own human health. We know we shouldn't eat 6 pounds of butter and 10 pizzas. We might want to, but we shouldn't do it. So, we've known these things. It's just making it, viable to do. So for sequestration, that's why it really got hyped, because of this awareness in the climate change circles. We're really in trouble. We really don't have much time to quit the gain in carbon dioxide concentrations. And looking at the relative cost and adaptability, this is attractive. And we see some places that have tried different mechanisms to get people to adopt those practices based on the climate benefits, right? In my opinion, that has not worked. So the first Kyoto Accords, the reason a lot of countries agreed to sign them is because they allowed carbon offsets in terrestrial sinks. So that sink is like sucking up carbon. And people are like, well, so then you're sinking it in there. But if somebody tills it up, it goes right back out. And people realizing, okay, well, growing forests and perennials is a lot better and more secure. So we have sort of a hierarchy of preferred practices, and we try to look at how much they could sequester and we could have rates of gain that might be expected. This has moved on to now. So we see in Europe this thing called the 4 per mil initiative, which had a lot of tie to UN policies and programs. And we had a real anxiety attack in the soil science community of people who worked on this for 20 years, where we have the perfectionists who were really like questioning the numbers and the rates and saying, this is a pie in the sky and we're overselling it and it doesn't have the permanence. And we're basically giving this outlet to not get on to making industry clean itself up. Because if you look at the relative rates of emissions and the costs, and you try to do it based on carbon sequestration rates, and you realize if I do the whole accounting, which we call life cycle analysis, this is a small piece of the pie. And if we fixed and cleaned up using hydrocarbons to fix nitrogen and apply nitrogen and let half that nitrogen leach into the water, that's what to shoot at. So we're basically focusing on this thing and selling it as a dream and diverting attention. So that a lot of scientists were picky about the numbers, picky about the rates. And so it's sort of the argument about perfection in the way of the good, right? So my take is the good is we get so much value out of carbon in agricultural lands and environmental buffering and for wildlife and, all of that land cover habitat, all of this ramifies into the real short-term immediate value of resistance and resilience to stress. So for resisting erosion, water holding for more yield. So, and in stress years, you really see this. I did my dissertation research at Rodale Research Institute, which has the oldest organic trial, and it compares it with conventional in the country. At the time I was there, I think it was 30 years old. And in a drought year, the conventionally managed soils could not really support corn growth. We were like 50%, it was really bad. And the resilience and crop yields, just that yield enhancement where you can actually build carbon and not organic systems, really depends on the farmer and the good combination of practices. So that label is, you could pick it apart, but there they had a very good rotation where you often see with organic, people are talking about rotations that have a perennial component. So they're growing hay and have a long-term cover and it really benefits the soil, and they might be returning animal manures. And so we often have these sort of things where people emphasize a piece or part, or we label things, and the label might be robust in some environments and not. So some people are like, to have sustainable systems, you need animals. Well, the animal is great if the animal is having feed that is perennial, but if you're feeding it corn, then you're busted that link. So, for soils and soil systems, those climate conversations, personally, I would say that's great, but I think all efforts to sort of monetize just the climate savings is so far not proven to be really successful. I think the thing is like the conservation benefit, the immediate need, the multiple, stacking ecosystem services, which
Right.
I realize it's interesting too. And maybe this is like a do-over. So in terms of just emphasizing the value of if you build soil organic matter, you sequester carbon and you can keep it there, which means recurring investment in putting high quality carbon into the soil, right? I think for farmers, helping them with whatever system they're doing, and that's kind of driven a lot by the market they're selling into, how to position themselves with their time, budget, and the difficulty to set them up. So, and get them to appreciate they're going to have a healthier root system, more nutrient retention and capture, so they don't have to, they're not going to have as much wasted nutrients, and so the value of carbon, and I did this trying to make this point, the money actually in carbon sequestration is you can put it right in agronomic terms, and you have a return on investment every year once you have it, built it. So
I think that just shows too that,
Yeah.
a lot of the practices, and we're talking about a lot of different things on this podcast this season, a lot of the practices that are being recommended to mitigate climate change or adapt to the climate change that we're seeing have a lot of other benefits too. And so there's a lot of ways that we can talk about it depending on what audience we're talking with or finding what matters to people. It might not be the climate change component, but there might be something else in that practice that is still beneficial to them. And then it helps the whole holistic picture, right? So there's a lot of different ways to look at it and values to kind of add up to kind of get to the collective goal that we're all looking at, right?
hmm
I think it also
Yeah.
too when you were talking, Michelle, that, we've talked many times on this podcast too about how everything is connected and, you pull one string and everything moves. So when you target in on just carbon only, and that's what we're going to do, when we're pulling those strings, what other strings are also being pulled or not being into or looked at what the effect of it is going to be. So again, that connection in these living systems is just important and complex.
Yeah. So I guess this is the interesting thing about semantics and sort of what is brought to mind when you use a term. So I think the carbon sequestration language and approach feels and is pretty top down. It's driven, from big scale policy and also has this abstract, long term, highly mathematical. So that's easy. But this, when you sequester carbon, you're doing these good things for the environment, for your productivity, right? For, well-being for the soil food web. That additive value, I think, is much more relatable. And that's the centerpiece for the soil quality, soil health conversation, right? So carbon sequestration as treated there is more about the utility and value to the person on the field and the adjacent land, right? And the water quality watershed. So it can ramify up to pollinators or sort of that. And I feel like that for many people, when they talk about soils and stewardship, they understand that big holistic picture better than they do when we break it into technical terms.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that was kind of where I was going to go next is how can we help raise more awareness, I guess, with the public? We've talked about farmers a lot today, but just with the general public about the importance of soil conservation in kind of this context of climate change.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. I haven't seen anybody really do research on the public's appreciation. So I appreciate your question. And I do things like this blog, this conversation about, I think for people, it's interesting where I think right now, when you talk about, for example, biodiversity or water quality, these things, a lot of what we're doing is using proxies. So we equate. So soil health or soil carbon are often proxies for all of these things. But something that might be more relatable and often is the twin of this partnership or the yin and the yang is land cover, right? So there are things that humans can influence through policy or through direct planting and management. So I think for the public, making that connection about the best thing you can do for soils is through land cover, right? Permanent land cover, and then the character of the cover. And if you care about pollinators or you care about, wild biodiversity, you talk about, you're worried about amphibians, you can really make that through line. And a lot of the costs and information and also regional knowledge about locations and land cover through remote sensing is becoming a driver of a lot of our environmental sciences, right?
Yeah, I like how you brought it back to land cover. And that's something that we can think about in the context of our own backyards too, for us as members of the public. We talk about this on the podcast too, converting your lawn into more native plants or putting in more trees and shrubs. And we've talked about pollinator and wildlife benefits. We've talked about water quality benefits, but it's also soil benefits, right? So again, connecting all those pieces together. And that's something that we can think about. And I feel like too, we've seen a huge, there's always been a big home gardener population, but I think the pandemic definitely increased that for a lot of us. And when we get a lot of, questions and extension about, well, what's going on with my garden? It all kind of comes back to soil. We say, well, really like the key for everything is understanding your soil. So I think that's an in too for a lot of people. Like I'm a backyard gardener and it's understanding and working in that soil. And that helps bring that connection into, right? And then can help better understand the larger conversation, right? About soil carbon and soil health and how it all fits together. We have that like personal connection too.
Yeah, and there too, the land cover or the plant as a indicator. As a soil scientist, I'm often saying, I just look at the plants as something for the soil. Plants have different sensitivities, and so I think for farmers, that's a thing again with sort of systems management. And I had being a faculty member, you have the great experience of having students, especially when they're good students. Now, I had a wonderful student that did a lot of work in raised beds, urban gardening systems, and in some places, especially where people have a relatively small resource, we find that they tend to overdo, right? If a little good is a lot better, getting themselves sometimes into trouble. So I think in terms of that, like for a person to manage carbon in their soil, I think often they're putting manure, carbon residues. So thinking about the residues of plants or even cover cropping, the green manures, that term, which is dated, a lot of people don't know, but you're growing the plant to feed the soil directly, right? That's going to be perfectly balanced for other plants because it's a plant, right? So, and then being aware, and a lot of people don't soil test. It's awkward. Maybe they don't want to pay, whatever. But if they can, that's a great thing to do and figuring out. Don't necessarily have to do it every year. If in your garden you have the idea of rotation and your heavy feeding crop, test before it, but you have an idea about not only what's enough, sort of the benchmark or sufficiency for the crop, what is a environmentally negative number, right? When is my phosphorus so high that I know I'm causing leaching of this? Or when is my nitrogen, likely to be too high, I'm causing a lot of denitrification? And so then there too, so I use this word denitrification, right? So for farmers and gardeners, I think this idea about efficiency, most of them are very practical, very smart, very wise. Their intention is not to cause a problem. It's to, to have it work well, right? So some of them, it's like, okay, well, if it's really wet, my poor husband, who was a farmer, I have him kvesh, like, is it too wet? I can't till now. Like, I'm walking around, I was like, yeah, you got to till because it's going to rain tomorrow, So then if you've done this thing that it wasn't ideal, I can remedy my soil. I can heal it by feeding it with a cover crop, right? So you can manage that. You can do simple, like back of the envelope calculations to do a nutrient budget. So, if I put on this much manure and I expect the crop to take this much out, then I have this much else. If I might have lost some to leaching, but if I'm doing this every year, I'm putting on way too much. And also lots of the manures, if they're like high value, like chicken litter, which is easy to apply, it's relatively, not so bulky, but it's got a lot of salts. And so you could salt stress your plants, especially, put a lot on, you're right near the seed, you're going to kill the seed, right? You see it dries out and you got a lot of white stuff on the top of your soil. That's salt, right? That's not ideal. So, I think for a lot of farmers, soil management, especially if they don't have a big area, they tend to do too much.
Mhm. Yeah, same with same with lawns, managing your lawn too. If you're having issues with your lawn, lots of times our first step when they call us is like, have you taken a soil test? Let's
Mhm.
get you where you can get that soil test first, and then we can figure out where we're gonna go from there. But that's kind of step one. And I know Extension has a really great soils website. You can put that in the show notes too, just for homeowners. I mean, typically it's kind of homeowner focused, but gardener focused too.
A long time ago, I did this thing for Pennsylvania, but I was sort of saying, okay, for a lot of people now, they have really made soil survey information very available. And so that's like the taxonomy. So for a lot of people, that's been not so useful, but it really is a great thing if people can just get an appreciation of their basic soil's potential. They understand its risk and vulnerabilities, maybe where it sits in a watershed, and if they care about wetlands, that kind of stuff. I think that can be developed for people with some technical expertise. So Extension, helping people navigate that. So there are some great resources on that front.
Yeah, web soil survey, my students, we use that a lot. They look up
Yeah.
their farm, they look at the soil types. I know foresters use that a lot, looking at the potential of what tree species will thrive and what the index is for those trees and how they can develop in those types of soils too. So yeah, absolutely. That web soil survey and other resources like that are very helpful to give you that background, right, on your
Yeah.
soil.
Yeah, and I think UC Davis had developed an app that's really, really nice using that web soil survey.
Okay.
Maybe a little easier.
Would there be any other resources or initiatives that you would want to recommend? if people wanted to learn more about soil and its connection to climate change to wrap things up?
So I think for farmers in the region, there's the Idea Farm Network and the Midwest Cover Crop Council. Both of them do really nice programming and conversation, that kind of stuff. I think for homeowners and backyard gardeners, probably then the Web Soil Survey and maybe the Davis site, which I'm sorry I didn't look up the name, are good options.
Wonderful. Yeah, those are great. Well, thank you. I mean, we really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us, Michelle. It's a lot. Soil is a lot. And I think that was one of my impressions when I first started teaching out at the Ag Center. I was like, whoa, you can take how many courses on soil? So yeah, we just thank you so much for connecting our soil health with climate change. It's really interesting to take that look. So again, we appreciate you.
Right.
It has come to the time where we are going to finish our episode with an everyday observation. And this is where we highlight the simple and normal things that you see in the environment that actually is really, really interesting. So we'll start with Erin to share your everyday observation with us today.
All right. So I was in my pollinator garden over the weekend, pulling some weeds that had popped up. Got a lot of Bermuda grass. That's just a constant battle. And I moved aside some plant cover that I had, and I found a dark brown caterpillar that was very large, and I got very excited. So, of course, I scooped it up, and it ended up upside down in my hand, and it flipped over right away. And I was like, this is very interesting. It was very large, had spots on the side, and had a little tail. So I knew it's a sphinx moth of some kind, but it looked like it was starting to pupate, like it was entering that phase. Its prolegs were like absorbed back into the body, and it would like twitch every now and then. And so it was really cool. I took all these pictures and then I put it back where I found it. I said, okay, you're in your little hiding spot under all this leaf cover. But it was really cool to kind of see that up close. I've seen some really big sphinx moths in my backyard before. And so I put it in iNaturalist. I wasn't able to tell what species it was in particular, but I thought it was really cool. Again, building up, it's been a year of building this pollinator garden at my house, and I'm already starting to see the benefits of it. So that was my everyday observation.
I love that. That's great. That's a plug for leaving some of your leaf litter around too, right? In your garden.
Mhm. Yep.
How about you, Michelle? What can you share with us today about your everyday observation?
I guess because I had seen your No Mow May and some of your comments, I think this is in our yard, because we have a big farm, a lot of the area in yard, we've quit mowing. And so we have little paths around it. But it's been very fun to see some of the native species and perennials that I have in my gardens moving into the yard. Because, we've talked about like, and I have some friends that are really good grassland biologists, and they're like, when people just abandon yards, it's not a prairie, and it's not, but it's like, well, and my other friends that if you want to build a prairie, you're going to have to use all these herbicides and kill the grass. And I'm like, I don't want to do that. So like, I've been kvetched about how to do it. Now I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to actually do what this idea of trigger sites maybe and help plant some of the perennials into the grass. It won't be perfect, but it might be a little higher utility than this. But in terms of the leaving the big areas, with the paths, I don't know. I haven't asked my really, really clean German friends whether it's horrible, but I think it looks okay. So that would be my everyday, and the flowers in it make it look really nice. So
That's cool. That's awesome. I love it when folks are try new things in their landscapes, right? Just like little bitty areas, and you're like, I'm going to experiment here and see what works or what doesn't work, and then go from there. We've talked about that a lot in a lot of podcasts, just like trying things first and seeing, what will happen. So awesome. Thanks for sharing. My everyday observation is kind of similar to yours, Michelle. We were out on a trail, I think 2 weekends ago with our master naturalist crew. We were working on just cutting back some invasive species that were encroaching on the trail. It was the same thing. Like, I have been working on my pollinator garden for a couple years, And, you go to the nurseries and you look for these plants and you're like, oh, there's Joe Pye weed. And oh, I've got Joe Pye weed in my garden now. And I'm like, oh, swamp milkweed. And then when I'm on the trail, they were just there. They were just there. Nobody planted those little guys. And it was Joe Pye weed and swamp milkweed that I'd really not seen too many times out in the wild, I guess, if you will. So that was cool because I could identify them. I was like, oh my gosh, these are like my friends. I remember Chris Evans, our forester. If you've ever watched his identification videos, he's like, and then when you keep studying the trees, they'll be like just like your old friends. When you walk up to them, you're like, hi, bird. That's how I went with Joe Pye. I was like, oh, hi, Joe Pye. How are you today? He was like my old friend that I saw out on the trail. So that's my everyday observation.
That's nice.
Love it.
This has been another episode on the Everyday Environment Podcast. Check us out next week where we talk with the Chris Evans that we just mentioned, our extension forester. We talk about invasive species and climate change. This podcast is a University of Illinois Extension production, hosted and edited by Abigail Garofalo, Aaron Garrett, and Amy Leffringhouse.
University of Illinois Extension.